Hello, everyone. My name is DAYA THUSSU. I'm professor at Hong Kong Baptist University. And it's indeed a great honor and a privilege to join you at the World Forum 4.0. This is the first time that I had the privilege to attend this, albeit virtually. So before I start about what I have to say, I would like to thank Mr. Manish Upreti, who invited me to be part of this conversation, and also the organizers, International Federation of Multimedia Associations, Social International University, and Global Foundation for Democracy and Development. My topic for today's brief presentation is a big one. I've titled it Reconfiguring Global Communication for a Post-COVID World. So it may sound a bit premature to speak of a post-COVID world where we are still dealing with the most serious public health problem that we have encountered for at least 100 years. But I think if one looks ahead, one could see some interesting trends emerging in terms of global communication, an area which I study and research and teach. So in my limited time, I will talk very briefly about what the global communication system is like, who is dominant, why that domination exists, and how that is changing, primarily because of the digital revolution, which is now almost everywhere in the world. Of course, the intensity and the range will differ, but excess is increasingly growing. And I want to focus specifically on what's happening in Asia, and within Asia, two of its biggest countries, China and India. And given the scale and scope of change in these two countries, how that change would force us almost to rethink, to reconfigure the traditional way of thinking about global communication. So I wanted to just say something in the context of historical issues, because it's very important to have at least a basic sense of history. Why is it that certain parts of the world, certain languages, certain kinds of technologies, certain discourses dominate the global communication narrative? So if we think about communication, for example, and if we connect it with British imperial history, and you will see that it's no surprise that a language which was spoken in a relatively small island is the language of global communication and commerce. And again, one has to kind of connect it with the major changes that happened in the 19th century when British imperialism was at its height. The most significant was the idea of cabling the world and the telegraph, which created a kind of communication infrastructure where, whether it's journalism or communication more broadly, everything prospered. One scholar has called the telegraph as the Victorian internet. Of course, with the internet, things have become far more complicated and the scale is massive. But a foundation of a global communication setup or system was set up in the 19th century. And since Britain was the most powerful country, it was able to set the standards of that. Of course, then other European countries, as well as United States, joined in. And in fact, this US-UK alliance that we see in other realms, whether it's politics or, cultural exchanges, etc., or media world, its foundations were set up late in the 19th century. And that continuity you can see even today. For instance, if you look at the global news media, the domination of US, UK media is very well documented. if you think of which are the major global media institutions, media organizations, I think of global news, we think of Reuters, we think of BBC, we think of CNN. When we think of international newspapers, New York Times comes to mind. When we think of financial news, is Bloomberg, or Wall Street Journal, or Financial Times. When we think of news magazines, Time Magazine, Economist, etc. So, in almost every sphere of global media, there is a very clear US, UK imprint. There are various reasons for that. History is one, language is another, but also the fact that their journalism probably they do a better job than many other countries, and they have a longer history of doing a kind of professional journalism for a global audience. And it's also something to do with the democratic traditions that exist in both the United States and UK with all its limitations, but it does create a certain space where a kind of argumentative media discourse can survive. But given this reality, their reach and influence, they have the extraordinary capacity to set the global news agenda. And they could decide which are the major stories which deserve attention, global attention. And of course, it's a very subjective matter, although they would argue that there are professional standards and we do things according to journalistic profession, and these standards do exist. But still, it is impossible to not see the kind of inbuilt biases that exist. And that then leads to the geopolitics of global communication. Certain areas of the world get much better coverage than other areas. For instance, certain wars are covered wall to wall, others are just ignored. And if there is a crisis, whether it is military crisis or civil crisis or even natural disaster, you also see that geopolitics, certain areas get better coverage and extensive coverage than is the case in much of the so-called developing world. And this has been there for a long time. There is a lot of resistance to this way back in the 70s and 80s. Some of you may remember there was a major movement against it at the UNESCO called the New World Information and Communication Order. And this was led by what was then called the Third World to try to deal with this imbalance of news flow. Of course, with the availability of digital communication, the expansion of the internet, things have changed. There is a lot more material now available from different parts of the world. And that complicates this kind of status quo, which has been there, as I said, from the 19th century. But even within the digital space, if you think of who are the big players, and almost without exception, all the major companies which basically shape the internet, control the internet, if you like, manage the infrastructure of it, as well as its software. We're talking about very few platforms. There's Google, Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft, and Netflix. All of them, without exception, American companies, hugely powerful, hugely influential. If Facebook was a country, it would be the world's largest country, which has got now 2 billion plus subscribers. And this has led to this notion of a kind of what one scholar has called surveillance capitalism. All of the data, all of the information is easily accessible. We, as consumers for free content, we use those platforms and trade our data for free content. So that's the, if you like, the current reality of digital world. But that status quo again is being challenged because although internet was invented in United States, as many of us know, it was a Pentagon project. It was from a defense establishment. It was only in the 90s it was expanded and globalized and privatized. So the US imprint is very, very strong. But if you look around in the world, the largest internet today is actually in China. It's a Mandarin-speaking internet. And China has its own digital properties. I can't think of any other country which has been able to develop its own version of Twitter, Google, or Facebook, or Amazon. And now some of these companies, Alibaba, Tencent, for example, two prominent ones, they're operating increasingly outside the Chinese space. They're increasingly operating in the global space. For example, in cloud computing, Alibaba has a lot of investment across the globe. A few years ago, I was involved in a book project with colleagues in China and in London, where I used to work before I came to Hong Kong. We produced a book called China's Media Go Global. And I had this phrase I used to describe this major change happening in the digital space in China. I called it cyber capitalism with Chinese characteristics. So China has been very, in my view, very cleverly protected its digital properties, not having to compete with Western American companies, keeping them out, and in the process, allowing this space for local companies to grow, and now they're operating at a much bigger scale. India, which has the world's largest open internet, because the Chinese internet is not open, it is very much controlled by a single party state, increasingly showing authoritarian tendencies. Indian internet is open, and more than 700 million people are now using that. And the growth has been phenomenal, primarily because of the mobile internet. What makes the Indian case even more interesting is the demographics of India. Although it's a very old civilization, as a nation state, it is a very young country. And a majority, more than a majority of 70%, in fact, of its population are below the age of 35. Now, that translates roughly into 700 million people. And these are increasingly educated, upwardly mobile, tech-savvy, and ambitious. So if you think that there are 700 million people who are already online, maybe it's crossed now 750, every month there are millions joining that figure. But that still means that 500 million people, 600 million people are not online. So just imagine what will happen when they will all join, which will happen the next 5 years, if not sooner. So that is creating a different kind of internet. Just sticking with these two countries, because the scale is so massive. In fact, most recently, last year, I was involved in a project with some colleagues from different BRICS countries: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And we produced 3 books about media in the BRICS countries. It was a Finnish academy-funded project. The leader of the project was a very well-known professor in Finland. But one of the books we produced last year, I had a chapter in it where we called it Deamericanizing the Internet, how BRICS countries especially, and my focus was on both India and China, given the population figures and the numbers involved. So there is this trend towards de-Americanizing the internet. If a vast majority of people who are using the internet are not using, the American version, as it were. Although in the Indian case, the platforms are still very American. They're working on domesticating data. They're talking about localizing content. Content is already to a very large extent localized, but the platforms they're using are still American. And there is a lot of debate going on about that in terms of surveillance, etc. So does that mean that we need to think perhaps slightly differently about this traditional way of configuring global communication as an English language space, as a US, UK dominated space? That is not to say that this domination has disappeared, but it has certainly declined. And what I'm saying about China and India, you can also extend that to many other big population countries. Russia would be a case in point, Turkey would be another. And it is interesting that there is a kind of a reaction against this domination, and that takes various shapes. So let me then finish with a few reflections about, as my title suggests, about this post-COVID world. And as I said at the very beginning, it may be premature to speak about post-COVID world, but I'm an optimist and I'm hoping that things will get better. I remember last year nobody was flying, but today people are flying, although it's a torturous experience I had one recently when I returned from London. My family is to come to Hong Kong where I work. I had to go through a third country and stay there for 21 days. Luckily, it was a country which is interesting. Egypt, my son works there, so I had a good time. So I'm hopeful that things will change. Now, why I am mentioning COVID? I'm not a specialist on health communication, or I'm not into that field. But I see it in relation to its impact, its geopolitical impact. And I think of 2007, 2008, when there was a major financial crisis in the United States and by extension the rest of the world. Many people started talking about this kind of Anglo-globalization has had its days. It doesn't work. So we need to think of alternative frameworks. And it is no coincidence that BRICS as a group came together after that crisis. And major economies like China, Russia, India, non-Western economies decided initially had to get together and think of an alternative framework. Although, as we all know, it has really not matured because there are intra-BRICS differences, most importantly within the two biggest countries, namely China and India. But it is also the case that these two countries are not just your average nation states. As nation states, they might be relatively young. India was made independent. India became independent in 1947, and in China, the modern China is based on this idea of a revolution, which at 1949. But as civilizational states, they have a very, very long and distinguished history and very distinctive history. And I think in an age where there is a lot of revivalism happening, and I think social media and digital communication has contributed to that process because it's connected all kinds of people. And these two countries also have the world's two largest diasporas. And this connectivity has created all kinds of narratives, some, quite rapidly nationalistic, others slightly more sophisticated, but the communication is happening very, very rapidly. So And on top of that, especially in case of China, it's a major economic power and increasingly military power. So that Western hegemony, which has defined modern world for last few hundred years, is being, if not challenged, but there is a little dent made in it. And in terms of purchasing power parity, China is already the world's largest economy. And forecasts are that by the end of this decade, it will be the largest in the world. India is the third largest economy in terms of purchasing power parity, and that's been the case for many years now. But even in terms of actual GDP, before COVID hit India very badly, it had actually crossed the GDP of United Kingdom, which is psychologically very important change for Indians because of their colonial baggage. So it's a slip down because of COVID and its after effect. But the fundamentals are very strong, and it is anybody's guess, and there are lots of stuff already written about it, that it will also emerge as a major political, economic, and cultural force. Unlike China, the Indian case is more complicated because it's a democratic setup, and as in most democracies, it takes longer to take decisions, to do things, but it's important to kind of recognize that the so-called rise of Asia is already making interesting interventions in how we think about international relations. I'll just end with a reflection about this idea of return of Asia, so rather than rise of Asia, because if we go back a little bit in history, we will notice that until the 18th century, a majority of global GDP came from Asia, China and India being the two most important players. So people have argued convincingly it is not rise, it is return. And if we take that kind of a view, we could say, okay, time is ripe for rethinking, for reconfiguring, so reconceptualizing global communication. And I think some of my remarks and comments may generate some interesting conversation, discussion, disagreement. I'll be very happy to take those questions given an opportunity. I must thank the organizers again to give me this opportunity to speak to you. And I wish it was more, it's not virtual like meeting in person, but I wish the World Forum 4.2 every success. Thanks very much and goodbye.